This is my 1-year-old Walstad method aquarium that currently houses my cherry shrimp and guppies. For today's video, I'm going to walk you through how I set this tank up, the challenges and successes that it's had over the past year, its current state, and my plans for it in the future. This specific tank setup was designed to be as cheap and easy to set up as possible, while also being relatively easy to maintain to make sure that anyone can try this type of aquarium and to try and make it as accessible as possible. I'm going to be sharing different tips and tricks that I've learned from this particular setup as we work our way through the video to try and help you avoid the mistakes that I made in your own tanks. So let's start with this setup, and this tank is a cheap 25 litre or 6.6 US gallon diverser tank that I picked up on Amazon. One of my main goals for this particular setup was to test out the idea of using moss mats in aquariums. The concept was to attach moss to a stainless steel aquarium grid to create a simple foreground carpet that would thrive in a low-tech Walstad method setup. Since I haven't tried this before, I decided to add all of the grids to the tank to make sure they'd fit without taking up too much space, because that is something that's important with a Walstad method tank, where you want to leave as much room in the background for plants as possible. I also had a couple of pieces of bogwood left over from another aquarium build, which I decided to use in the mid-ground for this tank. To be honest, I'm not a big fan of bogwood because it releases a lot of tannins into the water that tint the water brown. These days I personally prefer to use spiderwood, morpani wood or corbo wood instead, as they release little to no tannins, removing that issue. That said, the grids and bogwood slotted into the tank nicely, leaving plenty of space in the background for stem plants, which is key for helping to maintain safe and stable water parameters. For the substrate, I used Westland topsoil because it's cheap and easy to find here in the United Kingdom. But any additive and enhancement free garden grade topsoil available in your country should work just as well. I initially sieved the soil to remove any debris, but I have since stopped doing this with my modern Walstad method tanks. These days I just check for rocks by hand when I add the soil to the tank, and it takes up less time and it's easier to do. I don't like to add rocks into the tanks because it takes up space that plant roots and soil could be using, but it's easy enough to feel them with your hand as you stock up the tank with the soil, and then you just remove them as you go. This particular topsoil does usually have a few small pebbles, but it's nothing major, so in reality you could probably free pour it directly from the bag into the tank if you wanted. Adding a background to your tank is completely optional, but it is something that I like to do just to improve the aesthetics. Instead of using expensive aquascape and backgrounds, I go with budget-friendly window privacy film that I get on Amazon. I originally added a white background to this tank, but I did later swap it out for a black one because I just prefer the darker backdrop for my tanks. Once the privacy film was applied, I used a craft knife to remove the excess, but a sharp blade or some scissors will do this just the same if you want to try it in your own aquarium. After that, I placed the hardscape and moss grids back into the tank so I could clearly see where the rooting plants would go at the back of the tank, and I started to add some topsoil. Over the past year, I've tested a bunch of different setups, and there's two main approaches that I've used in various tanks, and there's this one where I only add soil to the areas where rooting plants will be placed, and then there's another method where I add an even layer of soil across the entire bottom of the tank. In my experience, at least for my personal needs, targeting the topsoil placement like this tank, where it will only be used where the rooting plants will sit, is a lot easier as it reduces the green algae problems in certain tanks. I did my best to keep the soil level in the background as flat as possible to give a smooth surface for the capping layer to be added on top of to help keep the substrate layers stable and even. This tank was originally part of an experiment that I ran last year with a lot of different aquariums, testing different soil and capping layer depths just to see what had happened with the tank as they progressed. For this one, I was adding 1 inch of topsoil for this particular setup, but I did some with 1/4 of an inch, some with 1/2 of an inch, and some with even more than an inch. Once the topsoil was in place, I removed the hardscape and moss grids again, getting ready to add the capping layer. Now I just want to quickly note that using 1 inch of topsoil can work well in tanks where the soil has a low level of water-soluble nitrogen, something that's clearly marked on the soil packaging in the United States, making it easier if you live there, but unfortunately that info is often not available on the packaging in other countries. Here in the United Kingdom and a lot of other countries, people just have to take a chance and see how that specific soil that they get performs, and that's why I try to stick to the exact same topsoil for every single tank, because I know how it's going to perform. The specific topsoil that I'm using for this tank does contain a decent amount of water-soluble nitrogen, so I do tend to use 1/2 an inch of soil in my more modern setups because it is easier in my opinion. Before moving on, I pressed down on the soil with my hand to try and remove as much of the trapped air as possible, which can potentially help prevent some issues later in the setup, but this step is optional. For the capping layer, I decided to try the Amtra sand and gravel mix since it was on sale back when I bought it and I hadn't used it before. I tested a small amount of it in a bucket with some water to check for cloudiness, and it was slightly cloudy, but it really wasn't as bad as some other products I've used, so I decided to add it straight to the tank without a pre-wash. At first I did try placing the gravel into the tank by hand, but it was taking far too long, so after a couple of minutes I did end up just pouring the rest directly into the tank until it reached the desired capping depth. Although the packaging clearly says that this has a grain size of between 1 and 3 millimeters, I'd personally say it's closer to between 3 and 4 millimeters, which is on the larger side of what I personally prefer for Walstad tanks. Now this does work perfectly fine, but I do tend to prefer something that's got a grain size closer to 2 millimeters, as that's fine enough to trap the nutrient layer and stop mud escaping, while it's also coarse enough to allow dissolved oxygen to flow into the substrate to the plant roots, while also being heavy enough to resist being easily moved by water flow. After getting the gravel into the tank, I smoothed it out with my hand to keep everything level and smooth in the tank. Until I found this clip, I was convinced that I'd only added 1/4 of an inch of capping layer to this tank as one of my tests on capping layer depth and how they affect water parameters. But if we skip ahead to a current shot of the tank right now, today at the time of recording, you can clearly see that the capping layer has thinned over time. Now I'm not entirely sure why this has happened, but according to the packaging of the gravel, it is meant to be inert and doesn't release calcium carbonate into the tank, and the tank's pH levels back that up, so it's not like it's dissolving like something like crushed coral can. Anyway, these days I do try to keep my capping layer in my Walstad tanks about twice the depth of my base layer. So for example, if I'm using 1/2 an inch of topsoil as my base layer, I'll try and cap it with around 1 inch of 2 millimeter grain size gravel. So with the substrate in place, it was time to add some water, and I've improved this method as well since recording. As you can see, I'm using the standard siphon with a regular diffuser attached on the end, but I have started to place a small piece of spare bubble wrap in one corner of my newer tanks to help absorb the force of the water. This small and easy tweak helps to protect the structure of the substrate layers and prevents the capping layer from becoming disturbed, which can cause the topsoil to mix into the water and create a muddy mess in your tank. At this stage, I personally only like to add around 1 or 2 inches of water, which is just enough to seep into the substrate and release any trapped air. That's why earlier in the video I mentioned that I pressed down on the soil with my hand to try and remove the trapped air in it to speed this section of the tank build up. While the bubbles are working their way out of the substrate, it's a great time to start prepping your plants and get them ready for planting. For this tank I chose to use Christmas moss, but in my opinion Java moss and Taiwan moss are both beginner friendly and better options for most people. The moss mat method that I wanted to try is very simple, and I simply lay some of the moss onto the stainless steel aquarium grid and then I wrap thread around it several times to hold the moss in place. These particular grids are stainless steel with a high chromium content because they are specifically designed for use in aquarium, or the extra chromium is supposed to make them more resistant to rust and safe for aquarium use. However, if you are concerned about rusting, you can also get some aquarium safe 3D printed moss mats from one of my friends who sells them on Etsy under his MMS Design Concepts brand. Once the thread is in place, the moss is securely held onto the grid until it grows out and anchors itself naturally in place, and after making all 5 of the moss mats that I needed, I decided to place them in the foreground of the tank with the goal of encouraging the moss to grow into a full carpet over time. Luckily, I did have some extra moss left, so I also added it to the 2 pieces of the bogwood that I'd been soaking in a bucket to try and make sure they wouldn't float when I filled the aquarium with water. Just like with the moss mats, I'd attached the moss to the wood using the thread using the exact same method to hold the moss in place securely. Once both pieces of the driftwood were mossed up, I added them both to the aquarium to fill out the mid-ground of the tank and provide some hiding spots for my shrimp after they are molten. So with the hardscape all set, it was time to start planting the rest of the tank, and I had some Rotala Rotundifolia, which is my go-to plant for Walstad method tanks and I highly recommend it, and I had some Bacopa Caroliniana and some Eliocharis ready to go. I started by breaking the Eliocharis pots down into small clumps of hairgrass, working off the theory that they'd gradually spread out and cover the certain areas of the tank where I put them. I planted one of the pots in the mid-ground behind one side of the driftwood, and then I added the second pot on the opposite side of the tank behind its side of the driftwood. While Eliocharis is typically used as a foreground plant, I just wanted this in the tank regardless of where it had to go, because my shrimp usually love to graze on the algae and biofilm that grows on it in my other aquariums. Next, I added my Bacopa Caroliniana to the far left and right sides of the background section of the tank. This plant grows very slowly compared to most other stem plants in the hobby, so it's basically useless for natural water purification for this type of tank. But back when I set this up, there was a lot of talk online about how Bacopa Caroliniana doesn't do well in Walstad method tanks, so I just wanted to give it a try, so I trimmed some from one of my other tanks and popped it in here. Finally, I planted the Rotala Rotundifolia, which in reality is the only submerged plant in this particular setup that significantly helps with natural water purification. I've actually made a dedicated video about how Rotala Rotundifolia is a super plant for aquariums, and I link to that in the video description if you want to check it out. With its medium growth rate, Rotala Rotundifolia requires a lot less maintenance than a fast-growing plant like Limnophila sessiliflora, but it still does an excellent job of naturally filtering your tank water when grown in a thick forest with a lot of stems like this. It also handles cooler temperatures well and consistently grows at a steady pace in my unheated Walstad method tank, so it still performs well even in the winter months. Aside from removing ammonium and nitrate from the water in your aquarium, research has also shown that Rotala Rotundifolia can absorb heavy metals to help manage TDS, making it a great plant for filterless Walstad method tanks. At this point, I did add a little tap water conditioner to my bucket before filling the tank up, just to get rid of any chlorine and chloramines to protect any beneficial microorganisms that I needed to grow. If you haven't already, now is the perfect time to move your own tank to its permanent location, as it's much lighter and easy to handle before you fill it with water. If I remember correctly, the specific light and heater that I wanted for this particular tank were both out of stock when I set this up, so I grabbed some temporary options from my box of spares. This is what the tank looked like at this stage of the build, and I know that it's not much to look at yet, but with time the plants will fill in and grow out into a full scape. Since the plants and beneficial microorganisms both thrive in warmer conditions, I set the heater to 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Diana Walstad recommends keeping tanks above 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and she mentions this at the bottom of page 200 in her book, so that's what I'm going to personally aim for moving forward with my new Walstad method tanks. On a quick side note, I set up this Walstad method tank a couple of months ago during the depths of winter without using a heater just to see how things went. Now everything went surprisingly well, but it did take a long time for the water parameters to stabilise before I could actually stock the tank, and it is definitely more challenging, so if you're looking to set up your very first Walstad method tank, I highly recommend you either add a heater or you build the tank during the spring or summer months so it can age in with the heat. Water flow also makes a big difference to this type of aquarium, as it helps circulate the excess nutrients and toxins and bring them into contact with plants that can absorb them as nutrients, or in contact with surfaces that have beneficial microorganisms on them that'll process them for you. Since I didn't want to use a filter in this particular setup, I went with one of these cheap USB powered water pumps, which works very well, and it adds a gentle flow to the tank to help maintain safe and stable water parameters. The final step of the build was to add some floating plants to the tank, and at the time of setup I was going through a bit of a salvinia phase, so I tossed some into this tank and I just let it do its thing. Here's some B-roll of the tank at this stage while I quickly talk about the importance of floating plants in this type of tank, especially if you're not using a filter. Unlike submerged plants that usually have a slower growth rate limited by CO2 availability in the water, floating plants have direct access to atmospheric CO2 and tend to grow much faster. This faster growth rate lets them soak up a lot of excess nutrients and toxins in your aquarium water to help stabilise your tank and keep your livestock safe. Now, salvinia is a great low maintenance option that will work well, but if you want the absolute best performance, duckweed is unmatched. There are plenty of research papers out there from the wastewater treatment industry and the phytoremediation industry that back this up, and duckweed is just unmatched when it comes to performance of floating plants. The only downside of duckweed is that it is a pain to manage, which puts a lot of people off using it. At this stage of the build, I randomly remembered about 2 3D printed aquarium shelves that I had in a drawer, so I decided to give them a try. I used the same method that I did with the moss mats, and I secured some Christmas moss to them using thread just to provide some extra grazing space for my shrimp, but in reality they didn't really use it, and I ended up removing them after about 3 months. So moving on to cycling the tank, and because the topsoil that I personally use contains a large amount of water-soluble ammonia, it leaches a lot of nutrients and toxins into the water column. With this specific setup, it's really not that much of an issue. It just jumpstarts the growth of my beneficial microorganisms, my floating plants, and my Rotala Rotundifolia, which all work together to help cycle the tank as fast as possible. If you're able to find a soil in your area that has a low level of water-soluble nitrogen, it won't leach much ammonia into the water column, and you may be able to add fish or shrimp on day 1 of the setup. You can see just how dense the salvinia got in this tank within about a month, but thankfully it's easy to manage because of its large leaf size, and you can just grab fistfuls of it and remove it. Here's some B-roll of me doing the tank's first trim while I explain a little bit about the cycling process. So brand new aquariums, especially those using nutrient-rich topsoils that release ammonia, can be dangerous for fish and shrimp if they are added too early. That is why cycling is so important on a new aquarium. Now, there are a few ways to speed up cycling, but at its core it's usually just a waiting game, especially if you're new and this is your first tank. Over time, beneficial archaea, bacteria and plants all build up to a level where they can safely handle the bioload of your aquarium. They all work together to convert toxic ammonia into toxic nitrite and then into far less toxic nitrate, which is essentially plant food for this type of aquarium. There's also ammonium, which is far less toxic than ammonia and nitrite, but in a tank as heavily planted as this one, ammonium rarely builds up because the plants also absorb that as a nutrient source. Now, some research papers do suggest that at least some plants can absorb ammonia directly, but that is debatable, and there's also plenty of research papers that show plants can directly absorb nitrite, especially if it's the only form of nitrogen in the water. But the tricky part is knowing when your tank is actually ready for livestock. Without a water test kit, it can be hard to tell if the cycle is complete in your tank. Now, I'm really not a fan of guessing because it does put your livestock in danger, but if you don't have access to a test kit, there are a couple of visual cues that you can rely on. In general, your tank is probably getting close to safe levels if your floating plants are thick and thriving across the entire surface of the tank like the salvinia shown earlier. Also, if your stem plants are grown fast enough where they've gotten to a stage where they need their first trim, it's a sign that your plants are actively growing and removing excess nutrients from the water. So by the time you've done your first trim of your stem plants, you might be ready to add your livestock. If you've watched closely on this video clip, you'll see that I'm actually trimming the excess Rotala and then I'm replanting those trimmings back into the substrate. This not only makes use of those extra stems, but it essentially doubles the number of stem plants that I have in this tank, boosting its natural filtration capabilities even further. But if it is possible, I highly recommend that you try and get yourself some sort of test kit, be it a liquid test kit or paper drip strips. As you can see in this clip, by this point of the tank build, the ammonia, nitrite and nitrate levels were all at 0 ppm, showing that the setup is good to go. So it was finally time to stock the tank, and while most people can easily start with 10 cherry shrimp and see great results, I was in a very different situation. After recently taking down another one of my aquariums, I had 87 cherry shrimp that were looking for a new home. To help them adjust to this tank's water parameters, I took some time to slowly acclimate them using a pipette to move water from the tank into their holding tub every 15 minutes or so. After doing this for probably 2 hours, the big moment came when I was moving them into their new home, but unfortunately I only captured it using footage in portrait mode, but you can still see all of the cherry shrimp being introduced to the tank. In my experience, it is completely normal to see cherry shrimp acting a little erratic when they are first added to a new environment. They may swim around frantically at first, but they usually settle down after an hour or two. Since these shrimp were the first inhabitants in this tank, all of the biofilm and microalgae that had built up during the cycle was theirs for the taking. It really didn't take long before they were actively grazing on any surface that they could find to eat as much as possible. That said, with a colony this large in a tank this size, supplemental feeding is definitely necessary to maintain their nutritional needs, but I will talk about that more later in the video. It even looked like at least some of the shrimp were keen to get started on making the next generation, and that brings me on to the next stage of the video, which is breeding the shrimp. Cherry shrimp are incredibly easy to breed, and it didn't take long for nature to take its course in this tank. The pale patch you can see on the back of this female is a cluster of eggs developing in her ovaries, which is a stage known as being saddled. After her next moult, she'll be ready to breed and a male will be able to fertilise the eggs if he can find her in time. After mating, the fertilised eggs are moved to her pleopods where she'll carry them around until they hatch. You can see that this female in the clip now has a full clutch of eggs just weeks after being introduced to the tank. This kind of setup is ideal for anyone looking to breed Neocaridina shrimp as a hobby, as I've raised hundreds of shrimp in this tank over the last 12 months. While numbers can vary depending on source, I have seen some sites say that a female in her prime can carry up to 30 eggs a month, so populations in a tank like this can exponentially grow if conditions are right. I did notice that some of the shrimp had even started to use the little driftwood cave that I'd added, which provides a nice sheltered area for them to go after molting while they wait for their new carapace to harden up. And it wasn't just the shrimp that were thriving, as all of the plants in here were doing great too. But with 87 shrimp in the tank and even more babies on the way, I was feeding the tank heavily to keep up with their needs, which brings me on to the next topic of the video, feeding. The natural grazing surfaces in this tank could easily support a small colony of Neocaridina shrimp with minimal supplemental feeding. However, since I had to start with 87 shrimp, I began adding high protein foods daily to meet their nutritional needs. There's a common misconception that Neocaridina shrimp only eat algae or biofilm, but this is not true. Gut content studies of wild Neocaridina shrimp have revealed that they often consume myofauna and mesofauna, which are tiny insects in their environment, suggesting that they are actually micro-predators and scavengers in the wild. In my experience, I've consistently seen higher breeding success when supplementing their diet with protein-rich foods, likely because it closely mimics the diet they've evolved on in the wild. My go-to staple foods are Fluval Bug Bites bottom feeder formula and Hikari mini algae wafers, which despite their name, actually has fish meal as their primary ingredient, not algae. Here's a clip of my cherry shrimp eagerly eating some bug bites, and you can see that they really enjoy eating them. I usually add 1 bug bite granule per 10 adult Neocaridina shrimp in the tank, but it can be hard to count them because they are excellent at hiding. This is another clip showing them eating some Hikari mini algae wafers, which they also seem to love. I usually dose these at 1 wafer per 40 adult shrimp, but they are easy to break down into halves and quarters to suit your colony size if needed. Each day I alternate between bug bites and the algae wafers as they have different primary ingredients, so it lets me increase the nutritional profile my shrimp get. Once the shrimp have eaten the food that I've added, I usually just leave them to graze on the algae, biofilm and detritus that naturally occurs in the tank to top up their nutritional needs, and it seems to be working perfectly fine so far. I also do my best to include treat foods at least once per week too. One favourite is frozen bloodworms, and in this clip you can see them trying to eat a few of them that I've added to the tank. I defrost a cube of bloodworm in some warm water, and then I add a couple of the worms to the shrimp tank and then feed the rest to my fish in the other aquariums. Another treat that I use is shrimp snowflake food, and while it is a little lighter on the nutritional side of things, my shrimp absolutely love it. The idea of this type of food is that mycelium will grow on the soybean husks that are included in it, and this does take time, but with my shrimp colonies they usually just eat the husks before any of the mycelium can even grow. Leaves are another excellent option, with oak and mulberry leaves being particular favourites of my cherry shrimp. One of the main advantages of feeding your shrimp leaves is that they'll release tiny little food particles into the water column that spread around, letting the baby shrimp that are in other areas of the tank get easy access to highly nutritious food. That said, in a filterless Walstad method tank like this one, all of those particles can start to cloud the water over time due to a lack of mechanical filtration, so try not to overfeed leaves. All of this food ends up getting turned into shrimp waste, which in turn nourishes the plants, creating a balanced, symbiotic relationship in the aquarium. On top of that, well-fed shrimp produce more offspring, which increases the demand for food, which in turn supports more plant growth, and the sustainable cycle continues. But there is an upper stocking limit on every aquarium regardless of its setup, so to keep population size stable, I've literally given away hundreds of shrimp to friends over the last year. In my experience, this 25 litre or 6.6 US gallon tank planted in this exact way can comfortably support a colony of around 100 cherry shrimp with ease. Now I know that a lot of newcomers to the shrimp keeping hobby, especially those coming over from the fish keeping side of the hobby, are often surprised by how low the bioload of shrimp actually is compared to fish. But that's one of the main reasons they are such a great stocking option for Walstad method tanks, because they are so low bioload, helping to keep the water parameters safe. During the summer months, my fish room can reach temperatures of 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit, so I ended up removing the filter from the tank at this stage because it simply wasn't needed. By this point, saddled and buried females were scattered throughout the tank, and I started to worry that I might actually end up with a population issue because they were breeding so consistently. Fortunately, a few of my friends and even their wives and children had recently gotten into the hobby, so I had no trouble finding homes for free Neocaridina shrimp, which made managing the population easy. Now before I move on, I just want to point out the colour quality of the shrimp in this clip, because most of them have a really solid bright red coloration, and I will be bringing this back up later in the video just to explain a point. Anyway, at this stage, no matter where I looked in the tank, there was at least one baby shrimp, and there was a lot of them at different growth stages, so it was really good to see how the colony was developing. This is actually my original cherry shrimp colony that got me back into the hobby in the first place, so it does hold some sentimental value for me. Now, cherry shrimp really don't live long, so while none of the original shrimp are alive, it is rewarding to see how the colony is still thriving under my care years later. This next clip shows how well the Christmas moss was starting to grow in after just 3 months in the tank. Moss can be a fantastic plant for shrimp tanks because it provides a ton of surface area for algae and biofilm to grow, giving the shrimp a consistent food source. It also offers some excellent hiding spots for baby shrimp, which increases their survival rate once you add fish to the tank. Here's a few wider shots of the tank so you can see how everything was coming together at this stage. As you can see, the Rotala Rotundifolia was really starting to fill out the background nicely, while both the Bacopa Caroliniana and Eliocharis were both a great fit in their respective zones. I did end up adding an air stone to the tank one day as I went to feed the colony and noticed that every single shrimp, and I literally mean every single one, was in the top quarter of the tank, which is a classic sign of low oxygen levels. But it also turned out to be the hottest day of the year, so I'm not sure if that was playing into it, but the air stone did help to restore oxygen levels and keep everything safe. As autumn rolled in, there was still plenty of saddled and buried female shrimp in here because the temperatures still hadn't really dropped by much. Even though I wasn't doing any sort of selective line breeding in this tank, the shrimp were maintaining their colour quality and there wasn't really any decline at this stage, and the shrimp still looked really good. As you can see in this clip, the plants are thriving and the shrimp are clearly doing well, so everything was progressing exactly how I'd hoped. Now, I can't remember exactly when I made the switch, but the light reflection in this clip reminds me that I did upgrade the lighting unit to a Sciora SR616, and I highly recommend it for tanks like this. It's cheap, easy to use, and puts out a surprising amount of power, which is easily enough to support beginner-friendly plants as well as some medium to advanced species too. Even as the temperatures continued to cool, I still had to top up the water about once per week. My method is very straightforward, and I simply fill a bucket with temperature matched tap water, then I add a water conditioner, pour it into a cut off Pepsi bottle, and then I'll gently add the water to any of my aquariums that need it. If you ever see your shrimp rushing to the surface after a water top up like they are in this clip, don't worry, they are not gasping for air. They are probably just trying to get to the biofilm and gunk that's built up on the tank glass to try and eat it as fast as possible. Now, there's a common myth that TDS or total dissolved solid levels will continually rise if you only ever top off the tank without doing full water changes because minerals don't evaporate. But multiple scientific studies have proven that certain live plants can absorb and hold many of these minerals. So while some people manage their TDS levels by doing water changes, other people can do it by pruning excess plant growth and removing that from their tank. I check the TDS in this tank regularly and it consistently stays around 250, which is well within the safe range for cherry shrimp. So around this time I did start to think that it'd be nice to add a few small nanofish to the tank just to add some more movement to the upper levels. My initial plan was to try and get some guppies or endlers, but that changed when a local aquatic shop posted on their Facebook page that they had Medaka ricefish in stock. Medaka are pretty hard to find in my area, so I didn't waste any time and I headed over to pick up a male and female platinum breeding pair. My plan was to keep them in this tank as a temporary holding space until their permanent setup was ready, so they are not permanent residents. After getting them home, I temperature acclimated them by floating their bag in the tank to match the conditions. The Medaka seemed really eager to explore, but since the shop was about an hour from my home, I wanted to slowly bring their water temperature up before releasing them. Quite a bit of fish waste had built up in the bag during the journey, so before adding them to the tank, I poured the contents into a holding container to let the debris settle, and then I netted the fish out and gently added them to the tank. Within a minute they were over the initial shock and they were already exploring the tank, likely on the hunt for food after their little adventure. Now if you're new to Medaka, you may notice something odd like in this clip where the female appears to be dragging a small ball behind her. That's actually one of her eggs attached by a filament she produces to help her anchor it onto plants. This is totally normal with Medaka and it's not a parasite or any type of health issue, so don't worry if you see this with your own fish if you give Medaka a try. I now keep Medaka with cherry shrimp and other Neocaridina varieties in 4 different tanks, and I've never once seen them act aggressively to the shrimp, making them great tank mates. The Medaka is simply too busy foraging for food or focused on breeding, and in my experience they just ignore the shrimp. Medaka are also great little fish that have a very low bioload, making them a fantastic option for Walstad method tanks like this one if you add them properly. But I did make a small mistake here, and then I ended up overreacting to that mistake. Since I didn't know when the Medaka had last been fed, I gave them some microgranules that I use with my other nano fish. But the problem is that I didn't adjust the shrimp's feeding schedule and I kept feeding the full portions to both species without reducing the quantities to compensate. To make matters worse, I'd also just bought some shrimp lollies that I was eager to try, and while my shrimp absolutely love whatever's on these, they can spike organic waste levels in a tank because there's so much food on them that is delivered to the aquarium all at the same time. Now this might sound strange if you are new to the hobby, but there are subtle signs in an aquarium that you can pick up on if you're used to watching that tank, like slight cloudiness in the water or certain types of surface film forming, and it's just an instinctual feeling that I had that something was wrong. So sure enough, to put my nerves at ease, I decided to do a water parameter test, and the ammonia came back that it had spiked up to 0.5 ppm. Thankfully, I had everything I needed in my fish room to respond quickly and fix the issue. I checked the water temperature of the tank and then removed a large portion of the tank water to reduce the ammonia concentration, and then I refilled the tank with temperature matched tap water that had been treated with a tap water conditioner to protect the beneficial microorganisms in the tank. Of course, I used my trusty cut-off Pepsi bottle to help me refill the tank, which is still one of my favourite, most used tools in my fish room for this specific tank, as it's at the top of my rack and I can't siphon into it. Now there is a myth that if you've only been using water top-ups like I had in this tank without doing full water changes, doing a sudden large water change like this one will harm your fish and shrimp. As the myth goes, there's some mythical compound that no one who spreads the myth dares speak the name of, so you can never Google it and research it, or perhaps it's because this compound doesn't exist. But according to the myth, once this Voldemort compound has built up to a high enough level and then suddenly reset due to a large water change, havoc will follow in your aquarium. Now at the time of recording, it's been 6 months since this happened, and guess who still has both of these Medaka in a thriving cherry shrimp colony? As far as I'm concerned, it's just more proof that with the right plant selection, and I can't stress that point enough that you need the right plants for this to work, a Walstad method tank can effectively regulate TDS and heavy metal buildup, keeping levels within safe ranges. Anyway, once the water change was complete, I tested the water and everything looked safe again. Now in hindsight, if I just reduced the feeding and didn't add any more shrimp lollies, I don't think that I would have had any more issues moving forward with the tank. But because I was frustrated with myself for making such a stupid mistake, I decided to order a nano filter and add it to the tank. Now, to be fair, this was partially because I just wanted some mechanical filtration in there to catch the leftover particles from the shrimp snowflake food and leaves, but I also wanted to get some water flow in there and some biological filtration as a safety net. A lot of people new to the Walstad method think that it's a 100% filterless method, and while that is absolutely possible as I've demonstrated up to this point in the video, even Diana Walstad herself mentions that she uses filters in some of her setups in her book and in her interview on the KG Tropicals YouTube channel. Now, I never use the included cartridges with hang-on back filters. Instead, I replace them with some 30 ppi foam for my biological media and some filter floss for my mechanical media. This is really easy to do because you just cut the foam and floss to match the size of the original cartridge that came with the filter and then slot it into the media slots. In most cases, the 30 ppi and filter floss sheet will cost about the same as a 6-month supply of the cartridges, but they will last you far longer and provide a lot more surface area for beneficial microorganisms. So I placed the filter on the tank, filled it up with water and then let it run, and it is still running to this day, but I am considering removing it again soon just to see how the tank performs filterless, but we'll have to see what happens in the future. By the time winter rolled round, everything in the tank had settled down and there'd been no more ammonia spikes or any type of problem in here. The Medaka ricefish had spawned a couple of times and laid eggs on plants, but I don't think any of the fry survived, probably due to the colder winter temperatures. The cherry shrimp were still eating consistently and consistently breeding, but it was at a far slower rate. The filter was actually doing a surprisingly good job of keeping the particulate matter under control from the leaves and snowflake food, but it is difficult to gauge its effect on the water parameters. At this point, the water temperature dropped down to around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was steadily moving towards the 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit mark, where it would remain for most of the winter without a heater. But around this time, my new Medaka tank had completed its cycle, so I moved my 2 platinum Medaka over to that tank to join the baby Medaka that I'd hatched from eggs over the summer. Unfortunately, I didn't capture any of the footage of adding the new guppies to the tank, but I do have some clips of them from their first day in here. I often get asked about the strain name of these guppies, but I can't actually remember what they were sold as, but I do think they are metal blue lace guppies. I only added 2 males to the tank to avoid breeding and overpopulation issues, and although some guppy strains can tolerate temperatures as low as 17 degrees Celsius or 63 degrees Fahrenheit, I did choose to re-add a heater as a backup during the winter, and I set the heater to 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. As you can see in the clips, both of the guppies have whitish tints on their lips on the day that I got them. This has caused me to panic a few times because I kept thinking that they had a mouth fungus infection, but eventually I realised it's probably just part of their natural coloration because it never gets any worse, and it hasn't spread to the 2 newer guppies I've added to the tank. You can see a lot of the baby shrimp that were born in this tank during the warmer months of the year nestled in the moss, and they have grown a lot over the last few months, but they will probably be my main breeding shrimp come the summer. It was also around this time that I replaced the salvinia with a mixture of duckweed and water lettuce, as I started to consider transitioning the tank back to being a filterless setup around this time. However, with plant and microorganism activities tapering off during the colder months, I did decide to leave the filter running through the winter just to be safe. Now, you might remember earlier in the video when I pointed out how bright the cherry shrimp were, but this is what they started to look like during the colder winter months. There was definitely a drop in colour intensity, but I'm not sure if that's due to colder water temperatures or if it's due to a lack of selective breeding, which has just led to a lot of low-grade offspring in the tank. Now, I was a little bit worried about the guppies surviving because I've had consistent bad experiences when trying to keep guppies in my tank, but thankfully they've settled in nicely and they are still thriving to this day. They have also left the shrimp alone and mostly keep to themselves, occasionally swimming down to try and steal a bite of the shrimp's food when they're hungry, but other than that there's very little interaction. But that's not to say that I'm not feeding the guppies. I actually give them a full scoop of micro granules each day, especially since I added the 2 extra guppies to the tank. They just try their luck and eat anything they can get. Even though Rotala Rotundifolia does grow fine in my unheated tanks, the heater in this one definitely helped it grow at a faster rate and I was still consistently trimming it. I ended up making a decision to try and not do any major maintenance or plant trimmings on the tank until I could record this video, as I wanted to show the tank in a fully grown out jungle style state. But eventually it got to the point shown in this clip where you can see the 2 new yellow guppies in here, and the fish really didn't have much space to swim around in, so I knew it was time to do some maintenance. I really don't think that the guppies are bothered about the dense plant growth in reality, because it just offers more hiding spots and there was still a lot of places that could go, but I did just want to trim everything back. This is what the duckweed and water lettuce were looking like at this point of the build as well, and they were still growing rapidly through the winter, which is great for maintaining stable water parameters, but it is a bit of a pain when it comes to maintenance. Now I'll speed this next clip up because it took me just over 7 minutes to trim the Rotala Rotundifolia and Bacopa down to size and remove the bulk of the water lettuce and duckweed. The trimming process that I personally use is very simple. I just try and hold the stem vertically and then cut it with my shears just above the water line to make a quick and easy cut that will work well for any tank size. I typically try and do a trimming session like this once per month, and if you stay on top of it with that frequency, it usually only takes a couple of minutes to do. This video clip shows how much plant matter I actually ended up removing during this maintenance session. Like I mentioned earlier, some people manage TDS levels through water changes and other people control it by removing excess plant growth, specifically plants like Rotala, duckweed and water lettuce, which is the bulk of this. After trimming, I did spend a few minutes using a comb to skim some of the excess duckweed off the water surface, as the comb method makes it quick and easy to get with the duckweed out of there. I know it's hard to see on camera, but my TDS meter is showing a reading of 240, which is right within the normal ranges for this tank, even though it's only had water top up since its issue with the Ammonia Spike. So with the trimming done, I topped up the water using my trusty Pepsi bottle cutoff, and the guppies seem to be really enjoying themselves because the water flow kicked up some shrimp food from the moss and the guppies were on it instantly. Now I know some people like to keep their tank glass spotless, but I usually just take a little bit of blue roll and wipe off any duckweed that's stuck onto the front glass pane, and then I really don't do much else. And that brings us up to today, which is early spring and almost exactly 1 year since this tank was originally set up. I'm genuinely really happy with how this aquarium has performed, and it's taught me a lot about the Walstad method, and I've started to apply some of the lessons I've learned from this tank to my other Walstad method aquariums to improve their performance. As you can see, the moss mat carpet method has worked really well, and it's formed a thick lush carpet that looks great, and the shrimp love grazing on it. As far as I can see, there's no signs of rust on the stainless steel grids either, so I have no plans to remove this anytime soon. I also want to take a moment to show you the background of the tank area, specifically the substrate, because it's usually hidden from the front view and you can see how little detritus and decaying matter is here. I often see people worried about detritus getting out of control in Walstad method tanks, and while it can with certain setups, I honestly don't do anything to manage it in this one. I honestly think that it's because the topsoil base is full of beneficial waste-eating bacteria, including certain strains of Pseudomonas and Bacillus bacteria. These microbes break down detritus and other waste organic matter, releasing nutrients back into the water column that the plants absorb, while also producing small amounts of natural CO2 as a byproduct. Some hobbyists actually pay to buy bottled products like Fritzheim 360 that include some of these so they can add it to a tank, but if you're using a topsoil based tank, it's extremely likely you already have them. One specifically helpful strain is Bacillus subtilis, which is a non-pathogenic bacteria strain, meaning it's not been linked to any type of fish disease, and it also has a very short doubling time of just 20 minutes in optimal conditions. That fast growth rate allows it to outcompete other harmful strains of bacteria using the competitive exclusion principle, where it will double and double and double and consume all the available food sources before the harmful pathogenic bacteria can get a foothold. Here's a quick update on all of the plants as well, and the Rotala might look a little bit rough right now, but that's because the maintenance session that I showed earlier only happened a couple of weeks ago, so it's still recovering. As I mentioned earlier, the moss is doing well and I'm really happy with how it's grown out, but unfortunately the Eliocharis does seem to have melted. I'm really not sure why it's melted because I have the exact same plant in one of my other unheated shrimp tanks with a cooler water temperature where it's just grown and grown and grown even during the winter. The Bacopa Caroliniana is struggling a little bit too, with the lower stems becoming leggy, but this is usually due to lighting issues, so I'm guessing it's because the floating plants and overgrown stems have just blocked out too much light. Thankfully, unlike a lot of the other guppies that I've tried to keep, these 4 guppies are absolutely thriving and show no signs of illness, and I'm so happy that I finally got some guppies that are doing well. These little guys are always active and sparring with each other and searching for food, and it is really fun to just watch them swimming around constantly because I do like to see high activity fish in my tanks. Now that it's early spring, temperatures are rising and I'll probably remove the heater at the end of this month since it won't be necessary much longer. The rise in temperatures have also seemed to trigger some breeding behaviour in the shrimp, and I'm pretty sure there's been a noticeable rise in the number of buried females carrying eggs in the tank. On a quick side note, here's the 2 Medaka that were in this tank as well as 3 juveniles, and they are currently in my undergravel filter tank temporarily while I rearrange parts of my fish room. As I mentioned earlier, I would really like to try and transition this tank back to being filterless. I probably won't try it until next month at the earliest, but I will closely monitor the water temperatures every day for at least the first week or 2 just to catch any potential issues. I'm really enjoying this tank because the guppies are hyperactive in the upper levels and there's so many cherry shrimp in it that are constantly moving around that there's always something to watch. Because of that, I do plan to keep this tank going in its current setup with its current stocking levels, and I'm hoping to film another update at the 2-year mark to show how it's performing. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end, and I hope that it's been helpful and has given you a more realistic look of what to expect with a Walstad method tank if you decide to do something similar for one of your own projects. Thanks for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end, and good luck with your Walstad tanks.